So it's a great pleasure to be with you today. As you heard very probably from the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission yesterday, Lord Turner, the Energy Transitions Commission has been working for several years now on how to reach global energy system and industrial systems that are actually net zero emissions by mid-century. And that reflection was really triggered by the IPCC report a few years back that indicated very clearly that if we wanted global rise in temperatures to be limited to below 1.5 degrees, we really needed to hit net zero emissions by around 2050. And what we've come to describe through the Energy Transitions Commission is a world where the developed economies reach net zero emissions before 2050, and developing economies like India can reach that objective by 2060, acknowledging the fact that different countries will not necessarily move at the same pace. What we have increasingly looked into when looking at how to reach net zero emissions is what we've called the harder to abate sectors of the economy in heavy industry and heavy duty transport, long distance transport, because we've realized that for most of the economy, solutions were quite obvious. And in some sectors like power, they were becoming cost competitive. But there were very particular bits of the global emissions that were much trickier to address because technologies are not yet completely commercially ready, and the cost of decarbonizing those sectors is much higher than other sectors of the economy. And so we've really narrowed down and focused our attention on those harder to abate sectors, among which cement is a key contributor of more than 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year globally. What is quite interesting when we look at the cement market is obviously that we are foreseeing a continuous growth in the cement and concrete production over the coming years and up to 2050, with the highest, sharpest growth actually expected in India and in Africa. Hence the importance of really understanding how the transition to net zero emissions can really happen in the Indian context, where it is likely to be one of the most challenging contexts given the high pace of demand growth. What we have done a couple of years ago now is have multiple exchanges across all of the harder to abate sectors, including cement and concrete, to really understand what were the pathways to reach net zero emissions and whether it was even possible, feasible to reach net zero emissions in those sectors. And we were very happy after multiple months of consultation with industry to reach the conclusion, which at the time was an unexpected conclusion for us, that we could really reach almost net zero emissions across all industrial sectors, including cement, without relying heavily on offsets, thanks to technologies that have already been identified and through solutions that have already been developed. Some of them might not be commercially ready yet, but all of them are known. We can point to their names, we know which they are. And in the introduction this morning, the president of the GCCA outlined some of those. So we've ended up describing the pathway to net zero emissions as a combination of three things. The first thing is demand management, really making our use of materials much more efficient. The second layer is energy efficiency improvement, which, as we know, is something that industries around the world and in India in particular has been pursuing quite aggressively. And the final layer is deploying zero carbon technologies. And in the case of concrete and cement, what is quite encouraging is that we actually have a portfolio of potential technologies. There's no one single bullet. We need a combination of technologies to enable different types of sites and different types of geographies to reach net zero emissions. And when we've looked at how to make best use of the resource that we have, we've realized that there were three major ways of enhancing the circular economy when we look at the built environment. The first key element is materials recirculation, and that's recycling. And recycling is, as we know, much tougher in cement and concrete than it is in metals. Metals are much more easily recyclable than cement and concrete. But we know that there are techniques to downcycle concrete, to as well as very new innovative technologies that enable to recycle part of the cement that was embedded in concrete, that we can pursue as opportunities to improve the use and enhance the use of materials. The second big pillar is building materials efficiency. So simply building buildings with less materials because they've been better designed, better conceived, with the same level of robustness, and also reusing building components that had already been put in place in the past. So second bucket of circular economy opportunities. And finally, the third bucket that we've looked at of potential opportunities is how do we best use the buildings we have, prolong their lifetime, and share the floor requirements, for instance, in office buildings, ensuring that there is high intense use of the space that has been built instead of rebuilding 3, 4, 5 more office buildings. So the combination of those three circular economy opportunities we've calculated could actually lead to a reduction in global emissions from cement by circa 35% by 2050. So it's not the whole story, it's highly insufficient, but it can be a very important contribution to the pathway of the sector towards net zero emissions. And it can actually trigger new business opportunities in areas that are not pure cement and concrete production, but that are related businesses around the use of those materials, the reuse of those materials, and the better management of buildings. But then when you have seized those opportunities, you still need to produce a significant amount of cement and concrete, and in particular in a country like India, we need to increase production of cement and concrete. So how do we do that in a net zero way? What we've done is a survey of all potential technologies that could help in that process. And what we've realized is that we need a mix of technologies to be able to address both the decarbonization of the heat and the decarbonization of the process, because we know that the chemical process by which you produce cement creates emissions in itself, which actually makes cement trickier to decarbonize than other sectors that only have emissions related to the energy they use. So we need a combination of things. We can switch the energy source, biomass and biogas being the most ready approaches, but there are also research going on around shifts to hydrogen, shifts to electricity. The change of feedstock is also particularly important, this time to address emissions from the chemical reaction. And finally, cement is probably the one sector globally where we need most carbon capture. Because in other sectors of the economy, we have alternatives to carbon capture to reach net zero emissions. But due to the chemical emissions, the process emissions from cement production, the cement and concrete industry is the one that most needs the development of carbon capture, combined either with storage on the ground or with use, but increasingly with uses that really enable the long-term capture of that carbon. It's not the same thing from a climate point of view. If you capture the carbon and put it in a fuel that gets burned, releasing the carbon immediately within a few months, then if you capture the carbon and use it to enhance your concrete, and that actually enables long-term sequestration. So we need to think carefully about which uses of carbon are actually good for climate in the longer term. When we look at these different technologies, What we've tried to understand is the economics and the relative economics of those. And what we've realized is that there wouldn't be any single technology that wins it all, because actually the cost competitiveness of those different technologies will depend on the local price of electricity. The lower your electricity price, the easier to shift to electricity or hydrogen as your main heat input. The higher your electricity price, the most cost competitive the carbon capture options. And obviously, depending on the location, some locations might have very cheap access to biomass. I know that bamboo, for instance, is one of the options considered in India, whereas other locations might have much tighter resources in terms of biomass and much higher prices of biomass and wouldn't be able to rely on biomass as an input. So the technology that will be the most cost competitive will really vary, not only from one country to the other, but very probably from one region to the other and from one site to the other. Because if your site is greenfield versus brownfield, the cost competitiveness of those technologies will be different. So it's very important to understand that, because policymakers tend to love to find the single bullet that they can invest into. And I think the message really is we need to invest in all of those technologies because we'll need them all on a global basis. What then becomes very clear as well is that the cost of producing cement is going to increase. And we're going to increase quite significantly if we really want to combine technologies that enable you to get as close as possible to net zero emissions in your cement production process. And that obviously translates in high business-to-business cost at cement level, concrete level, construction level. But when you look at it from the perspective of the end consumer and what it represents for the increase in cost per house, that increase in cost per house might actually be much lower than one would have expected, because there are many other dimensions of costs in your construction costs of the building, including other materials, including labor force, including networks and electricity networks, water networks, etc., that actually represent a fair share of the price of your final construction. That will obviously vary from one type of building to the other. It will vary from one location to the other, also depending on cost of labor. But it makes it slightly more palatable from an end consumer perspective to accept that extra cost that would come from lower carbon and eventually zero carbon cement. So the barriers that we need to overcome are multiple. There's an innovation difficulty, because some of those technologies, if I'm thinking, for instance, electrification of the heat process in cement, are quite early stage and still need to be tested, demonstrated, developed. There is a big cost differential issue. There is an asset turnover issue, because we know that cement kilns have a 30, 40-year lifespan. So investments can be very easily stuck into high carbon infrastructure. We also have a big challenge in cement because of the importance of carbon capture around the development of the CCS infrastructure. And that requires permitting, it requires a whole system that needs to be impulsed by government to build that big infrastructure that will be required for the cement industry. And finally, we need to overcome the fact that this is quite a fragmented market, and it's more difficult to have a lot of small to medium-sized businesses move into a certain direction than it is to move a sector where there is 10 major players globally. Obviously, there are major players in the concrete and cement industry. There's a higher number of smaller players than some of the other heavy industry sectors. So what does that mean for what we need to achieve in the 2020s, kind of coming back? I've just gone through the 2050 vision, but what does it mean for the next 10 years? What we've realized is that there are multiple things that need to happen in the 2020s, hence the urgency of really working together with industry and with the rest of the value chain to accelerate progress. Because if we want to reach net zero by mid-century, then before the end of the decade, we need to ensure that all low carbon technologies that are required in the cement and concrete industry are commercially ready. And this is not yet the case. So we need significant investment in R&D and in early deployment of those technologies. We also need to start deploying those technologies because emissions need to start coming down. And so for that, we'll probably need investment support from the public sector to really enable companies to start investing at scale in those technologies. And most importantly, in the case of India, where we expect growth in the market and where we expect new assets to be built in the next decade, even before all low carbon technologies are actually commercially available, we need to make sure that any new asset or any major investment in existing assets will be compatible with the transition to zero carbon so that we don't lock in high carbon infrastructure. So we need to think through what are the transitional options that will enable us to keep investing in new assets in the next 5 to 10 years, but ensuring that those assets can become zero carbon over the lifetime without waiting for the end of their useful life. And then finally, we need to start deploying CCS infrastructure. So how do we do all of that? What GCC has been doing over the past 18 months is working with a range of partners, including the World Economic Forum, the Rocky Mountain Institute, Women Business, and we are now very happy to be collaborating with GCCA on a global basis on the concrete and cement angle particularly. So what we've developed is what we've called the Mission Possible Partnership, which is an umbrella for sector climate action in the harder to abate sectors of the economy. And the objective of this new organization is to really enable any energy intensive sector to reach an agreement, international agreement across companies in the value chain with support from governments on how they're going to decarbonize and how much they can do in the 2020s, and really make players around the table commit to specific actions in the 2020s. The way we do that is by really leveraging the power of cross-sector collaboration. And what we mean by that is that we're very aware that we can't ask the cement producers alone, or the concrete producers alone, or even the construction sector alone, to take all of the cost of that transition and to move alone in a competitive market where if you're the first mover, you might actually get out competed by some of your competitors who are not moving at the same pace towards decarbonization and therefore do not face higher costs. So what we really need to manage to do is ensure that those first movers in the industry are operating in a favorable environment, that there is collaboration with the energy suppliers, so that the energy suppliers really enable you to access low-cost renewable energy, that there is good collaboration with equipment manufacturers to ensure that you have access to as cheap as possible technologies, that there is good collaboration with customers, in particular public procurement services, because those customers can absorb part of the cost that green cement represents. That there is good collaboration with the finance community as well, because the finance community can help invest in the first few commercial scale zero carbon plants, and they can also help you access better interest rates if you do things right from a climate perspective. And finally, mobilizing support from governments in terms of both creating a level playing field across the industry and supporting investment in new technologies, as well, as I said earlier, as really driving public procurement to pay for higher price green concrete and cement. And so it's our conviction is that to help the industry in this decarbonization pathway, we really need to mobilize this full value chain to enable you to operate in a much more favorable environment than until now, and to secure, make it safer to invest in zero carbon technologies at a much faster pace than normal market economics would allow. And so I'm really looking forward to working with GCCA and working with the companies around this table to help us deliver on that vision. Thank you very much.